I'm here with Simon Hall, and we're discussing a few things on Mortem and Glorium. And Simon, a little while ago I saw one person mentioned online that some of the tables can look rather empty of terrain, but I see you have a very advanced terrain system. Maybe you can just run through terrain in Mortem and Glorium and show us what there is.
I think the first opening comment is that playing lots of periods as I do, you're not going to get the same sort of terrain mainly that you would have seen on a World War II table or a developed period. It is true that the majority of ancient battles, they tried to find some sort of plain to fight on in between terrain.
Okay.
But some of them were fought in very dense terrain, so we need a system that covers both. So actually the most important thing to get games looking good, first of all, for me, are the mats, because that gives you the nice backdrop of a nice plane in itself.
It's easy, portable, and it doesn't come apart like some terrain.
Exactly. And if you look at ancient battles, there's really two things that go on with terrain. The first is very often people trying to find a way of securing their flank on a piece of terrain. Be it a river or a coast or something to protect one side of their army. Sometimes both sides. So the terrain system has got one part of it about whether or not there are secure flanks. And then the other bit is about the density of terrain, which on average is light once you've gone through that. So we have a system which we'll do properly in a different video, because it takes a bit to go through, but it's built around this sort of slightly abstract map which is showing different types of flanks. So these two have got no secure flanks at all, but with these you've got secure flanks varying from some roughish sort of woods all the way through to some completely impassable water. And then you've got terrain along here from featureless, which has got almost nothing other than that, up to very dense, which is a lot. Now, you will see most of the games have moderate to low terrain, but you will also see ones with lots of terrain. So in the system, if you were very dense with a secure flank, with one of these you could potentially have 11 pieces of terrain.
It would be in the middle of a forest in Germany.
It would be, it would be walking through a pass in the middle of the forest, in the middle of the Black Forest, and there wouldn't be much open space.
Quite an interesting battle.
It would.
With no supporting flanks or anything.
Plenty of places to ambush. So I would say most terrain you will find, most battlers probably will have just 2 or 3 features, is the most normal. I mean, that would be a common feature to have quite often. People try and lock themselves onto some sort of secure flank, so we can have that as a coastline or a river. So your lightest terrain, you have a very slight chance of having nothing. It's not very common. Your most common terrain, I would say, will probably have something like that, and maybe a couple of pieces of roughish going, and the army is fighting a battle in between that stuff. And these terrain pieces, the system deliberately tends to push terrain pieces onto the edge of the battle.
And of course certain troops would benefit from certain terrain, so I know elephants, for example, would walk through the rocky ground.
But some heavy cataphracts trying to operate, and that would be a disaster.
Yes,
exactly.
You really want to get your enemy pikes in there.
So I would say probably 50% of games are probably going to be like that. There's going to be sort of that level of terrain and the other side of it.
And your terrain system, I know you're going to go through it in more detail, but basically the 2 sides manoeuvre on this board.
On a map to create where the battle is fought.
You get to add or take away terrain as you manoeuvre.
So if we go more extreme, I would say you've probably got about 25% of games probably would be more like this. They'll have a couple of, let's put some big forests down on the side, say. So you might have a very heavy forested side in there, and you'd have a couple of more pieces. So probably another quarter of games, you'll probably get something where the terrain looks like that. So here we've got a ploughed field.
It's a fairly close
and that's got a reasonable amount on it, but still probably a reasonably open space in the middle. And then if we keep going from there, that's now got 6 pieces on. There's probably another 15% that have got another couple of small items on there. So that'll be something down here. We have things called impassable terrain, so you have a completely impassable piece of terrain there. And your most extreme, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, which I have seen a couple of times. You might end up looking at something like, let's put a village on the other side.
That would be when generals accidentally bumped into each other. Because it's not the sort of battlefield they would have deliberately picked.
Exactly. Or it's, you know, somebody's been caught out and has retreated into some terrain that makes a battle actually difficult.
Okay.
You know, so this might be, let's say, a Gallic army that's been caught by a Parthian army full of cataphracts that definitely doesn't want to play in the open, wins everything in terms of this pre-battle game,
and imagine a bunch
sets
of
them up loaded with as much terrain as again. But to do this, both sides would need to want it, because 3 of these pieces would have to come from the opposition. So even if the Gaul was doing that, probably, I think the maximum they would get is 6 extra. So the maximum they get is this: these 2 for a secure flank, which had to be put down, and then they would have 4 compulsory pieces of terrain, and he would have an option of 3. So it would be something like that. If everybody went for it, I don't think I've ever seen it happen, so I'll have to just double check, but just for fun, very dense 2, 4 and another 3, so we would have 10 and additional to those. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There you go. So if everybody wanted as much terrain as possible on the table, you could plausibly, at the absolute limit, end up with this many pieces.
Okay, they better have been extreme battle.
I mean, everybody would want to do that, but now it starts to look more like a World War II battlefield, actually, with lots of hills and trains and woods and villages.
If I was a bunch of Scots Highlanders taking on Edward's army, I might want to try and lure his knights into something like this.
You might be delighted, but I mean, you will only get that though if both sides want it.
Yes,
you know?
yes.
So the most you'll get if only one side wants difficult terrain is 3 pieces less.
Okay,
something like that.
Even this would be quite a challenge.
It would, and so not many. So maybe you'll see 10% of battles have heavy terrain, and maybe another 15 have what I'd call fairly heavy terrain. Take a couple of these off, you know. So maybe leave that on, take that off, leave the hill there, and then probably down to half. You're coming at the thing, and probably. I think about 1 in 100 games will have nothing at all. It'll be a completely empty play.
I've seen quite a few games where the terrain tends to build up on the edges and tends to be a little bit more open in the centre, which makes sense.
That's deliberate. The way the system deploys terrain, you have a dice roll, and the dice roll is 1 or 2 it goes in this flank. 3, 4 it goes in the middle, and 5 or 6 it goes on that flank. Okay. But every time you have an odd number, it has to touch a table edge. Okay. So there's actually only a 1 in 6 chance of being allowed to put something in the actual
cases
centre.
your terrain's going to hug the edges.
It'll get driven around the edges, and then there's a dice roll for your opponent to move it, so it could come back in a bit. But to actually land a piece of terrain smack in the centre there, you have to roll a 4 on that die. D6.
And that's the only thing.
It's the only thing you can do to get something smack in the middle. So it's deliberately designed for ancients to push the terrain more around the edges, which is if you did a study of 100 battlefields, maps is what you will find. And to deliberately emphasise the secure flank part, because that's actually a big part of ancient warfare. You would find, I mean, the Greeks fighting the Persians secured their flank on the sea many times. You know, people secure their flanks on a river.
Something like this, if it's in the middle of your battle lines, it's going to make your command and control rather awkward.
It is. And if somebody's got very good troops for fighting in and they pinch it early, you've got a real irritant in the middle of your battlefield. And actually, an important aside here, as the scoring system for MeG is very deliberately aggressive. So you get points mainly for doing damage to the enemy and then a bonus for winning in total. You can't sit back and get half the points available by doing nothing. So it's very positive. You have to find a way to deal with it. You have to think of a plan. And if you think about that, that's right for history as well. Because once you're in a battle, nobody lined up their battle troops and thought, right, let's sit here and do nothing. That was very rare. You know, everybody is trying to think of a way of actually winning, because they've got all their troops together. And actually holding an army together logistically in the ancient period was very difficult. You know, whether that was a supply problem, just getting the food and the logistics straight, or a command and control problem of keeping a bunch of tribes interested in staying together, because basically they were in it for the victory and the plunder. You really wouldn't sit back and not try and find a plan to win.
Interesting campaign games can come out of this.
So you'd have to win. And there are very few battles that aren't like that. I mean, even something like Hastings, which is probably the nearest I can think of other famous battles where they've quite sensibly stood on a hill for a long time to hold their ground.
A very specific scenario that has
a victory. They were drawn off it and by a feigned flight by the Bretons, but they came off because they wanted to win. It wasn't just They were suckered into it. They thought they were now winning. They stood on the hill to exhaust the enemy with repeated charges, and then win late in the battle once people they just happened to have called it wrong, and William the Conqueror fooled them into doing it too early.
You almost never really see two armies sitting on the edge waiting for the enemy and not.
No. And the other thing you'll find in the system, which is why we talk about terrain, is you won't find a lot of what people used to nickname as corner sitting either, because if terrain's like that and somebody sits across here, the flank march rules in this are such that if that's obvious, then it's a real hazard.
Okay, and that's where you want your secure flank.
A blank table edge isn't a very secure flanking MeG, especially against any armies that have got flexible cavalry. Because they can very easily end up coming on behind you. So I did play a game early on against somebody who did that with a long line of Roman infantry and had some cavalry held in reserve. And I was playing a honeycomb, and there's no way they can get round. You have to shoot the front, and the Romans, which you like, have got a characteristic called shield cover. It's a big shield, so they can hide behind the shield and soak up lots of missile fire. Unfortunately, in turn one,
they arrived.
And it's quite a high probability 4 Huns came on this side, and shield cover doesn't work backwards. so it was a bit difficult to, for all directions, it was a bit difficult. They got charged in the rear and all sorts of stuff. There's only so much. So you don't see that very often either. People tend to come out and try and win a battle rather than try and sit and not lose a battle, which is a very healthy thing from a game point of view.
But then terrain isn't necessarily a complete blocker. Different units obviously work differently in terrain.
Well, let's do some interesting stuff with troops.
Some of your flexibles.
Yeah, no. Let's imagine you're playing a terrain like that against a lot of Greek hoplites, with one of the Thracian armies. The Greek hoplites might secure all these areas, but your loose order Thracian infantry, they're quite dangerous, can walk straight through this stuff and fight in it. And the pace that in the game they can get around there is reasonably quick. So it can be quite challenging. And even light horse, so a bunch of Numidians will gradually work their way through there as long as there's nothing opposing them, and come out the other side.
And of course, if you've got something like legionaries, you can switch into loose order.
Exactly.
Go through there. Switch back into close order and be in your back.
So that might be a very interesting one. Yeah, if this was a little bit further forward here, for instance, to bring some legionaries out here, spin them out, and then pay the card to put them back into solid locked together formation. You've now got some really good tough legionaries.
That's where the manoeuvre really comes in.
And now you're using your drill skill for the Romans, rather than just lining them up and getting them fight.
And of course, working together with archers over, say, for example, some swampy ground or ploughed ground or something.
Yeah, can be very effective.
Could be.
Yeah, I mean that can be very effective because if people are coming through something that you can shoot at and they are slowed by this. So imagine these are cavalry coming towards you. They're slowed to probably 3 going through it. Well, because you've got the slowing effect of fire, you very often knock 1 or 2 off their speed. Now, of course, if they're moving 5 in the open, then dropping to 3 is not so bad. If they're moving through that and start at 3 and drop to 1, it's a disaster because they're going to
it will take them 4 turns just to get across the field.
Which is actually the Agincourt scenario.
Yes.
Is that they were just slowed down and slowed down and slowed down, so they took so many volleys of arrows that it caused chaos. But even despite that, they still had stakes because you can't survive in the open with bowmen against charging cavalry very easily without some protection.
And of course you could use terrain to make historical battlefields as well.
Yeah, of course. You map those. I mean, we did the Battle of Sabis. I think we've got online because we have a show where we do called Two Simon Show where we cover battles. So we have the Battle of Sabis. Sabis is very interesting because it's over a river. It's got a river and some forests and a Roman camp in the centre. And you just deploy what feels right for the battlefield. Cannae was secured on a river on one side, which the Romans failed to use very well for security. They decided to deploy far enough away from it that they could be enveloped on both sides, which is always an interesting puzzle as to quite why that happened. And if you do some of the Alexander the Great battles, they're ploughing over a river, and there are rules for transverse rivers in here for scenarios, but we don't use them in the standard game because they tend to get in the way of a good game.
Okay,
so
that's
special scenarios only for that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And of course, making terrain is quite an interesting hobby in itself. A lot of people actually, I tend to do that as much as I do anything else.
Well, these are all various things that have been custom little bits of artwork that people have produced. So that's a lovely base for a field, or for a wood if you put it on. That's one somebody designed for a forest, which when you put enough of these trees in gives a nice dark background to it. Or you can
build these hills.
You can build your hills, or you can stick those on a base to represent a ready-made village for the period. I mean, I've seen some magnificent terrain out there. I mean, it looks stunning. It's just you won't have hundreds of pieces. You'll have one or two really nice, spectacular pieces of terrain. And I've got the camps as well. If you play the bigger game, these can be beautiful. You know, that's my Sassanid camp for my full Sassanid army, and itself is a lovely piece of terrain and feature to put on the table.
Once you're playing the bigger games, taking a camp is quite a big deal.
It is. You do not want to lose your camp. It can actually cause quite a lot of a mess. Yes.
Okay.
You know, your army can disintegrate and decide to go home. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Batterang.
A pleasure.